Hey, what's up everyone? John here with Web Dev for You, here to help you build awesome websites without code in Webflow. Today I'm going to go over 3 layout tips in Webflow, and these are just things I kind of wish I knew early on when I started with Webflow. These are things that I kind of just learned as I built more websites in Webflow, but I think these different layout tips can help you build your sites faster and hopefully give you some design ideas and kind of inspiration for your own projects. So the 3 tips I'll be covering today are placing an absolute full div inside of a relative positioned parent element. And this allows you to create interesting effects like this, where when we hover, we can have an image scale within a parent element. So with this tip, you can pretty much fill a parent element and you don't have to set width or height. And I find myself using this type of layout idea in many different situations. So I'll be covering this as the first one. The second layout tip I'll be covering is filling the available space of a parent element with Flexbox. And this allows you to kind of create effects like this. And it allows you to create equal width divs without setting a specific width to an element. So let's say you have 3 divs inside of a parent element and you want it to be a row. You don't have to set the width to 33.333%. You can just set it to fill available space within a Flexbox parent element. All right, so I know I'm saying a lot of words. This will all be clear as I go through the tutorial. And the last layout tip I'll be covering is creating a grid layout. So for example, I have this Figma file and it had kind of this grid layout, and this would be a bit difficult to create with Flexbox. So with grid and Webflow, we can create really unique layouts like this using specific grid matrices in Webflow. So this is a 3x3 grid, and it allows us to create different things like this. Actually, it's a 6x4 grid, I should say. Yeah, because we can have 2 cells down here, we can have 3 up here, we can have 2 in the middle, and have them be different sizes. So these are the different layout tips I'll be covering in today's tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is the absolute full and relative positioning. So I'll go into Webflow. I have a blank site here, and I'll just get started with adding a section, and we'll call this section layout 1 section. I'll go ahead and set the min height to 100 VH so it fills the entire viewport. I'll give it a flex setting of flex, center, center, and then in here I'll add a div block. I'll call this div block image wrapper, and we'll give it a specific width and height. You can set it to percentages or anything you'd like, but I'll make it 500 by 500 pixels in width and height. And for this image wrapper, I'm going to set the position to relative. So this is really important because I'm going to add an absolute position div inside of this image wrapper. So inside of the image wrapper, I'll hit Command K and I'll add a div block, and I'll call this image. So this will be the actual image. And rather than setting it to 100% by 100%, which would work as well, I can set it to position absolute and full. So now it fills the entire parent element, which is the image wrapper. So now I can go in and add an image. So I'll go into the backgrounds, click the plus, choose image, and I'll select this image here, set it to cover, and position it in the center, and I don't need it to be tiled. Okay, so there we go. So why was this position relative important? Because if we remove the position relative off the image wrapper, the image will fill the next parent element that has a position of relative. So if I change this to static, we can see the image wants to fill, I think it's filling the body here because we don't have a position relative to the section. So I believe it's filling the body. And let me just double check that by adding a section. And we'll set this to section 2. I'll delete this in a second. and no, it seems to be filling the section, so it'll fill the next available element here. So that is why setting this to position relative is very important, because we want this absolute position div to be relative to this image wrapper. Okay, otherwise it'll fill the next parent element with a position of relative, or in this case it seems to be the first element on the page. All right, so that is the first kind of idea there. And what can we do with this? So now that we have the image inside of the image wrapper, it's set to a position of absolute, I'm going to go ahead and add some a border radius to this image wrapper. So I'll set it to 24, and notice nothing is happening, and that's because we need to set the image wrapper to the overflow of none, of hidden. So the image won't overflow outside of the image wrapper. And what this will allow me to do is create that rotate effect. So with the image wrapper selected, I can go to interactions, I can click the plus, select mouse hover, and on hover, we're gonna start an animation. I'll click the plus, and I'll say image hover in. And then I'll select the image, and I'll say scale, and then I'll scale it to 1.4. And then we'll set it as the initial state, and then I'll rotate it, let's say 30 degrees on the z-axis. I'll set it to the initial state, then I'll duplicate these two, and we will scale it back to, let's say, 1.2, and we'll rotate it to 0. So now if I preview, we have that rotation effect. And I can set the easing for both of these to ease, and we'll make the duration 1 second. Click save, then on hover out, I'll start an animation, I'll duplicate, and I'll say image hover out. I'll delete these first two, these initial states. For the scale, I'll set it back to 1.4, and for the rotate, we'll set it back to 30 degrees. So basically the same effect, but in reverse. And that gives us this animation. So the main takeaway from this first build is that if you're placing any element and you want it to be absolute positioned within the parent element, make sure that the parent element has a position of relative. You can then fill that parent element by adding a div, setting it to absolute, and then clicking full right here, and it'll fill that element. So just really useful, allows you to do really interesting things in Webflow. You can then set the image wrapper, the parent element, to an overflow of hidden, and create some really cool scale and effects. So again, I find myself using this idea a lot, so I just wanted to share it as the first tip there. The next tip we'll go over is the fill available space with Flexbox, and this is a really interesting one. So let me go ahead and add another section in Webflow, and I'll call this layout 2 section. Yeah, so this first one wasn't really a layout per se, but when creating layouts, you can use this idea to create really interesting things within individual layouts, if that makes sense. Okay, so we have layout 2 section. I'll give it a min height of 100 VH. So we have the second section in here. Again, I'll give it a flex setting of flex, center, center. So anything we add will be in the center. And then I'll go ahead and add a div, and this will be the flex wrapper. And for this, I'll give it a width of, let's say, 80% and a height of 500 pixels. So this will be the flex wrapper. And then in here, we're going to add a div block. So I'll add a div. And actually, before I do that, let's give the flex wrapper a flex setting. So I'll say flex, horizontal, align, stretch, and justify start. So the parent element, which is the flex wrapper, needs the display setting to be flex. Then I'll add a div, and then I'll say flex item. So this will be the flex item inside of the flex wrapper. And for the flex item, we want to, here under flex child, under sizing, we want to say grow if possible. So we'll click there, and this will fill the available space within the parent element. So now all I have to do is hit Command C to copy, and then paste 4 times, and I have 4 equal flex items in width. And if I delete one, we can see that it just fills the available space. I can add as many as I want in here, and each of these flex items will be the same width. Okay, so I'm going to add 4 here, and I'm going to go ahead and add images to each flex item. So for the first one, I'll click backgrounds, I'll click the plus, choose image, I'll select this one here, set it to cover, position it in the center, and I don't need it to be tiled. Then I'll click on the second flex item, give it a combo class of 2, and then just change the image, and we'll set it to this one. Then we have 3. So yeah, the third one, we'll click on it, set a combo class to 3, and give it a unique image. So we'll say this one here, and then we'll give this last one a combo class of 4, and we'll go ahead and change the image to which one was it? This one here, or this one. Yeah, cool. All right, so we have the 4 images. It looks good. Let me go to the first flex item. So I want to, any properties I want applied to these 3 here that have a combo class, I want to apply the property to the element that doesn't have the combo class, because these all have the base class flex item. So if I apply any settings to this, it'll apply it to all the other elements with the base class of flex item. So I'll go to the first one. Let's give it a border radius of 24, and let's give it some margin of, let's say, 20 pixels from the left and the right. So if I preview, we have our flex layout, and this is the really interesting part. So I can make these elements grow and shrink, right? So if we go here, we can see that they grow and shrink. So the way to do that is we select the first flex item, then we go to the hover state here in the class selector. We'll select hover, and then we'll say, we'll click these 3 dots here. So rather than grow if possible, we'll click these 3 dots and we'll grow it to twice the size. So in the grow option, we'll say 2. So 1 would be the original size, so 2 would be twice the size. And so when we hover, these flex items, they grow. Okay, so now I can go back to the none state. So that was the hover state. We went to the 3 dots here under flex child and grew it to 3 or 2. We could even set 3 if we wanted it to be larger, but I find 2 is pretty good. So now I'll go back to the none state, and when I go to the individual images, they grow. So now we want to add a transition to it so it's smooth. So the way we do that is we select the flex item, and we go down to transitions. Under effects, we go to transitions, click the plus, and here I want to select flex, and for the duration I'll say 300, and now it has a smooth flex transition to it. And just like that, we have that layout there. All right, that looks good. So that was a layout tip number 2, where we can fill available space with Flexbox. So as we can see, as each flex item grows, it's set to fill the available space, and that's why we get that cool effect of the images growing and the other images shrinking. Okay, so that is layout tip number 2. So layout tip number 3. So there's often this, not debate, but there's this kind of back and forth between what should I use, flex or grid. I use flex when I just have a kind of a single row or a single column. That's when I use flex. If I need really kind of advanced layouts like this, where images are different sizes, and we have multiple rows and columns, and everything is a different size, that's when I defer to Flexbox, because defer to grid, because grid just lets me create these really unique layouts that are multiple columns and rows with different sizes. So let's go ahead and add that. So in the body, I'm going to add a section, and I'm going to call this layout 3 section, and we'll give it again a min height of 100 VH. I'll scroll down and we have the section. I'll give it a flex setting of flex, align center, and justify center, or we could say align top here for this layout. So now I'll go ahead and add a div, and we're going to call this grid wrapper. I'm going to set this to a width of 60%, and we'll set the height to 1000 pixels. All right, so I want the the layout, the grid layout, to be that size, and we can adjust the size later on. The size isn't too important right now, because after you build the grid, you can set it to any size you want, and it will just adjust the size of the elements inside of it. All right, so 60% in width and 1,000 pixels in height. So now with the grid wrapper, I can go to the display setting under layout and select grid, which is this grid icon here, and I can add a grid. So for this example, I'm going to be using 6 columns, and why am I using 6 columns? Well, these 2 images down here are going to be 3 columns each. This one right here is going to be 2. This one's going to be 4 columns. This one's going to be 2 columns, 2 columns, 2 columns. And then for the rows, we're going to have, this is going to be 2 rows, 1 row, 1 row, 1 row, 2 rows for this big image, and 1 row at the bottom. Okay, so this is where you can get creative with, how many grid cells you need to create your unique layout. So here, when I select grid, so I have grid selected, and after, I have it selected, so let me do that again. We select grid, it brings out these options. So I want 6 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it tells you here 6 columns, and I want 4 rows. Okay, great, so there's my grid. And now I want to add div blocks inside of each, for the grid. So I'll add a div, and I'll call this grid item. And I want this to fill 2 columns and 1 row. So I can reference this layout here. Actually, I want this to fill 2 columns and 4 rows. Okay, and then I'll add another div inside of the grid wrapper. I want this to fill 2 columns and 1 row. And actually what I can do is just, I can hit Command-C to copy this grid item, then click on the grid wrapper, which is the parent element, and paste, and then I can resize them in here. So I want all of the grid items to have the class grid item, and that's why I'm copying and pasting. So again, I'll click on the parent element grid wrapper, paste, and I just want this third one to be 2 columns and 1 row. I'll paste again. This is going to be the larger image, which I want to be 4 columns. You have 4 columns and 2 rows, just like that. So that's the larger image. So we can see here we have this larger image, and then I'll paste again, and I just want this one to be 2 columns and 1 row. Then I'll paste again, and I want this one to be 3 columns. This actually should be, 3 columns and 1 row. Then I'll hit Command-C again and paste, and this will be 3 columns and 1 row. So just like that, we have our unique grid layout, and it's great. Webflow just lets you, select the lower right-hand corner and lets you fill available grid spaces, which is really unique and very useful when building layouts in Webflow. Okay, so now I can fill each grid item with an image. So I'll select the first one, and we'll go ahead and add an image. So I'll choose an image under backgrounds. We'll select this first one. I'll set it to cover, position it in the center, and I don't need it to be tiled. Then I'll go to the second grid item, give it a combo class of 2, choose image, and we'll select this one. The third image, give it a combo class of 3, choose image, and we'll select this one. Fourth one, give it a combo class of 4, choose image, we'll select this one. And fifth image, give it a combo class of 5, choose image, we'll select this one. Sixth image, give it a combo class of 6, choose image, and we'll say this one here. And then the seventh image, give it a combo class of 7, choose image, and we'll say this one. All right, and we can change the alignment, or we'll leave it at center. Okay, so we have our grid of images. I can go into the first grid item to affect all the other grid items because they have the same base class of grid item. And I'll give it a border radius of 24. And boom, just like that, we have our grid of images. Nice, so let's say I want to make the grid a different size. I'll just select the grid wrapper. I can make it 80% width and 2000 pixels in height. and this will just be like a really large grid of images. Kind of like it maybe like 1500 pixels in height, maybe 70% width. Okay, there we go. And I'll add some padding to the section, maybe 100 pixels to give some breathing room. And boom. Awesome. So yeah, you can get creative with it. You can, you know, if you want it to be smaller in size, you can do like that. Just have a nice little grid of elements. I would do, yeah, maybe something like, you know, it all depends what you're going for. But that's just a really cool way to create a grid. And what's cool about this is that, you know, you can add this effect into the grid. So I'll select this image wrapper. I'll delete this first grid item in here. Actually, how do I want to do this? Yeah, I can just paste that in there, or let me see. Yeah, let me remove this image and we'll just paste it in the grid item, and the grid item will set to a position of relative in here. So that's, oh, because it has a specific width and height. So let me undo that, let me redo. So inside the grid item, I'll go ahead and paste that first effect that we created, and then for the image wrapper, I'll go ahead, I'll give it a combo class of 2, and I'll remove the width and height. I'll just say auto and auto here. Or actually for the width, we'll say 100%. All right, so we can add the effect inside the grid. I affected all the other grid items, so probably not the best example. So let me undo that again. All right, so we'll do it to this last one in here. So I'll remove the background image, paste in there. And then for this image wrapper, we'll give it a combo class of 2. We'll remove the width and the height. We'll just say auto. And for the height, yeah, 100%. And there we go. Okay, cool. So we would have to kind of work with the scale in effect. And for the image, we probably have to scale it a bit more. But yeah, that's just one way to kind of add that effect in there. So I just want to see if I can play with this a bit to get the effect a bit better. So maybe on the image hover in, I'll have to scale it a bit more, maybe to 2. Yeah, so it depends, you know, the width and the height of the specific grid item to see how much you'd have to scale it. But there we go. Because when you scale, you don't want the image to be cropped inside of the div. Okay. All right, so there we go. Hopefully that made sense. You know, everything I went over. So the first kind of layout tip is placing absolute divs inside of relative position parent elements. The second one was placing flex items inside of a flex wrapper and have it grow inside of a flex wrapper, or having elements be equal width by filling the available space of an element. So that one was just, you know, we set a flex setting to the parent wrapper, so the flex wrapper, and then the flex items have a grow if possible setting applied to it. And the last one was just a grid display setting applied to a parent element, and adding grid items inside of the parent element to create a unique layout. And then we combined the first layout tip with the third one to add the effect that we created inside of a grid item here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and publish, and we can take a look and see how it looks on a published site. All right, so that looks good. We kind of made it even more pronounced by changing the scale to 2, which looks good. Then we have the flex grow. So remember to add that transition to make it smooth in the under effects in Webflow when you change the hover state to grow, or yeah, change the grow setting in the hover state. Otherwise it'll just kind of click in. So you want that smooth transition. And then we have the grid kind of images here. All right, so yeah, that is it for these 3 tips. These are all ideas that I use pretty frequently in Webflow, and I just wanted to share it. There's many use cases for these 3 different layout tips, and yeah, there's much more you can do with it. So hopefully you find that helpful. Hopefully it saves you time with building your layouts in Webflow. So that is it for this video tutorial. If you're new to Webflow and you want to get started, feel free to click on that first link down below. It'll take you to webflow.com. So it is an affiliate link. I am an affiliate with Webflow, and it just helps me if you do decide to sign up with Webflow, like create an account or get a site plan. It helps me out, and it just supports the channel. So that is in the link below. You can get started with Webflow for free. You can have 2 projects, and each project can have 2 pages to allow you to play with Webflow and kind of feel it out and kind of start learning how to use Webflow. So that is it for this video tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video tutorial. Thank you.